Hello, and welcome to the third installment of Library Design Matters, a webinar series on various aspects of library design, brought to you by the International Federation of Library Associations Library Buildings and Equipment section. I'm Traci Lesneski, CEO and principal with architectural firm and library design specialist MSR Design, and I'm delighted to be your host today. With me is Philip Kent, University Librarian at the University of Sydney. Philip will be monitoring the chat for your questions and moderating the Q&A at the end of the session. Behind the scenes, ensuring that all goes smoothly, is Diane Cohen, Senior Director of Planning and Resources at McGill University Library. Diane, Philip, and I all serve on the Library Buildings and Equipment Section Standing Committee. And on behalf of all of our LBES colleagues, thank you for joining us today. Today's theme is designing for new services in an uncertain future. Libraries have always needed to flex with the evolving needs of their communities, and the past 18 or so months have shone a new light on the need for responsive and resilient buildings. Our panelists will be delving into considerations, challenges, and tips for smart planning and the future proofing of library buildings. We will be looking at three very different projects: a state library, public library, and an academic research library. Each project is unique, and yet you'll see similarities in the role of stakeholder input in the design process and thoughtful approaches for supporting working, learning, and collaborating now and in the future. First, a few housekeeping items. Please post any questions in the chat. We will answer as many of them live at the end of the session as we can. If you have technical issues, please direct message co-host Jacqueline Sundberg using the Zoom chat or the email address that's now posted in the chat. If you'd like to see closed captions, please click Live Transcript, the icon with CC on it, available in your Zoom controls. This webinar is being recorded. You can find it afterwards on the IFLA website and on IFLA's YouTube channel. Next slide. To ensure plenty of time for our discussion, I will keep the introductions of our panelists brief. Full bios are available on our IFLA Library Buildings and Equipment blog site. We will put a link in the chat now. On to brief introductions. Sarah Slade is director of the award-winning State Library Victoria, one of Melbourne's most iconic buildings and a cultural jewel. Sarah led a process to reimagine and activate the library with the goal of improving client user experiences. Welcome, Sarah. Peter Cook is director of the Midden-Brabant Library. He led the process to create a mixed-use knowledge hub dubbed Lokaal, located in Tilburg, the Netherlands. This exciting project breathed life into a massive historic industrial site, making it the cultural heart of the city. Welcome, Peter. Jeanette Blackburn is architect and principal with Shepley Bulfinch, an architectural practice based in the United States. Jeanette will be discussing the collaborative approach being taken in the planning and design of McGill University's Fiat Lux project. Her work is informing possibilities for this transformative project for McGill Library. Welcome, Jeanette. First up is Sarah. So at this time, I'll ask that Jeanette and Peter turn off camera and audio, and Philip. And Sarah, please turn on your audio, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Traci. On behalf of State Library Victoria, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands of all the Victorian Aboriginal clans, their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that the State Collection holds traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around Australia. We support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. 6 years ago, the Victorian Government announced a significant commitment to begin the transformation of State Library Victoria. We called this project Vision 2020. Next slide, please. On the surface, Vision 2020 was about more spaces, revitalised spaces and new services for users. With 2 million on-site visitors a year, we were already Australia's busiest library at bursting point, with visitation growing significantly year on year. Next slide. Vision 2020 would reopen long neglected heritage rooms and through flexible design provide revenue as venues for hire. Vision 2020 was about maximising access in the broadest sense. Access mobility, of course, but also increased access for new and emerging user groups by providing spaces that welcomed them and worked for their specific needs. As you can see here, over the past decade, we had experienced a 200% growth in children and families using the library, and this was a key new user group. Next slide. Victoria's rapidly expanding startup sector had become a force in the Victorian economy, generating $4.6 billion in 2019. Vision 2020 allowed us to look at the support we could provide to early stage entrepreneurs. Next slide. A third of the library's patrons are students, often working on collaborative projects in groups. Vision 2020 allowed us to rethink our spaces so that collaborative work and silent study could coexist. All of this was informing our vision, but underpinning it was a realisation that our buildings contain more than people and collections. They contain and communicate ambition, hopes, and confidence in the future. Next slide. As Winston Churchill said, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us, and therein is a weighty responsibility. The State Library has a rich and celebrated architectural heritage, going back to Joseph Reed's original 1850s designs. Next slide. It has been added to in numerous expansions and redevelopments to become 23 connected buildings, occupying a full city block in central Melbourne. Building into that heritage in a way that meaningfully reflected the hopes and ambitions of our communities, while honouring the institution's important history, required a community of minds. We consulted with users, took advice from historians, architects, engineers, and heritage experts. Talked to staff, to people in university and government, in cultural and business sectors, and colleagues in public libraries across Victoria. And we took those conversations seriously. The ideas were distilled by our architects, architectus and Schmidt-Hammer-Larsen, culminating in the designs you saw earlier. With these, construction began and the enormous logistical ballet of redeveloping a heritage building while never closing it to the public began. After 5 years, we completed Vision 2020 on budget, on time, and true to the designs and our purpose. And we're very proud of what was achieved. Have a look. Next slide. The completed redevelopment was open to the public on the 5th of December 2020. We could immediately see that the designs were working as intended. Next slide. Traffic flows were seamless and people were finding their way to the new spaces and using them well. Next slide. Then, just 3 months later, as with all of us, COVID-19 changed all that. Next slide. The building was empty and the library was no longer a physical space, but a virtual one. But that didn't mean the work of Vision 2020 was for nothing. In fact, the work done to inform its design, the needs it responded to, helped us focus our efforts as we made the digital pivot. For children and families homeschooling, we programmed online storytime readings and creative workshops. Next slide. For entrepreneurs, we hosted online festivals to connect them with some of Australia's leading minds in the startup world. Next slide. As a place of trusted information, we created online events with experts in health, the economy and education, helping people understand what was going on. Vision 2020 had given us great insight into how important the library is to people's sense of community, belonging and well-being. When the library building could no longer provide a space for calm contemplation, we created a series of bibliotherapy podcasts to help our community find relief. Next slide. As we emerged from our first lockdown, we discovered the design principles used were paying other unexpected benefits. Next slide. A global pandemic was not why we increased our public space by 40%, but because we did, we have more open spaces, less crowding in thoroughfares, greater distance between desks, easy to clean surfaces, all making COVID-safe operations possible. Next slide. At the design stage, the library incorporated streaming and conferencing technology throughout the site. This made it possible for us to share on-site events more widely and more accessibly than before. Vision 2020 created our Entrepreneur Centre, Start Space, meaning the library is positioned to provide real help to a recovering community. And thanks to Vision 2020, the library will be a driver for reviving trade in Melbourne city centre. By designing a flexible and future-facing way, we have been able to meet the COVID challenge and return real value to our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Such a great story. And given that your building opened just a few months before the pandemic hit and the design was working just as you planned, has it worked as well during the pandemic? And is there anything that you would have done differently? It certainly seems like it's worked well.
It's worked incredibly well. One of our board members said during the start of COVID-19 that one of the measures of an organisation is how well their purpose survives a crisis. And you could apply that to the design principles we use for Vision 2020. If you think of that, did the design survive the crisis? It really did. It doesn't look, all of the COVID interventions don't look like they're interventions. They look like they were designed to be there and the space was designed to work in that way. The other thing that was key to the design that I hope people saw in the videos and some of the slides is that we wanted to design it in a way that people could have their own space for doing what they were interested in. It might be collaborative work, it might be silent study, it might be in the children and families quarter, but they could see what else was happening in the spaces. So they felt they had their own space, but they were part of a larger community. And that works in a post-COVID world as well as it did in a pre-COVID world.
That's wonderful. That's really great to hear. And that connectivity is so important. Technology certainly can play a role in that connection as well. Was there a role for technology in your ability to flex for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. We had designed, one of the considerations that we have, being a state library, but obviously being based in the major city of the state, is that often people see us as the Melbourne City Library. And so one of our great aims was to make sure that we were serving all of the state. And so we had introduced technology throughout all of the spaces so that we could cast things that were happening in the library to the rest of the state and vice versa. And that, of course, helped while we were working remotely, as we still are, in fact. Still got about 3 more weeks of lockdown here.
Yes, we'll be safe. One final question. There's often tension between honoring and preserving heritage buildings such as yours, and then providing that adaptability that you've been talking about and showing in the wonderful images. How did you navigate that tension in the design?
One of the really clever things that our design team, Architectus and Schmidt-Hammer Larsen, did was they looked for all of the interventions that had been included in different parts of the library over all of the decades that it had been worked on. And they stripped all of those things back. So they took it back to the bare bones of the original designs and architectural designs and features when that part of the interconnected library buildings was constructed. And by doing that, it honoured the original heritage, but it also removed a whole lot of things that weren't working very effectively. So it helped increase the flow and it helped make sense of the buildings. You get drawn into different spaces. The fact that you can see what's happening in other spaces interests you and keeps you investigating. But in doing that, you're still honouring exactly what was originally intended with each of the heritage spaces.
That's wonderful. It looks like we have time for just one more question, and I'm looking at the chat actually, and I see that somebody has asked how you achieved a 40% increase in public space.
So it's a very good question. We had varyingly, as with all of sort of major cultural institutions like State Library Victoria, we have a mix of on-site collection storage, on-site staff spaces, as well as public space. And we had spaces where you can request different collection items with different security requirements. So there's public spaces where you can get things off the shelf. There's areas where you have to order things and have it brought to you, but you're under limited supervision. And then there are areas where you would go in to view very significant items under more strict supervision. So we rethought the staff and those spaces across the site. We had an early works project as part of the whole of Vision 2020 that relocated a lot of staff from mixed use spaces that we had before. So we consolidated a lot of the space in that way. That allowed us to open up a lot of spaces, but we also significantly restored the original library, which you can see behind me, which is the Ian Potter Queen's Hall, which for decades had not been available to the public.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you again, Sarah, and really appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Thanks,
All right, we'll have you turn your camera off, and before Peter turns his camera on for our conversation, we're going to watch a brief video about the Loch Hall project.
Tilburg is a city of approximately 200,000 residents in the Netherlands. Entrepreneurship, collaboration, co-creation and innovation are its foundation. In the heart of the city lies the Spoorzone, previously an industrial area. Today, a variety of startups and creators moved into the area. Next to the central station, we find the Loch Hall, with the newly built library.
Ja, ik vind de vergelijking is voor mij makkelijk te maken. Vroeger was hier een hal waar 150 mensen werkten aan locomotieven. En dat krioelde door elkaar. En dat zie ik nu terug door de studenten, door de jongeren, door de jeugd die hier komt, de ouderen die hier komen. Ik vind het geweldig om te zien.
The old locomotive hall has been stripped to the bone and rebuilt except for its original glass and steel frames, which have been preserved. The unique and open character is still intact. The entrance hall takes the form of a covered city square with large public reading tables and a coffee bar. Around the square, there are staircases which can be used as event seating for hundreds of spectators. The library also offers more than 300 diverse workspaces. Open spaces can be closed off with spectacular movable curtains, a real eye-catcher. The building's design inspires visitors to discover something unexpected and to have meaningful encounters.
Het is toch heel erg belangrijk dat de bibliotheek voor al die generaties is en die er ook graag met elkaar komen. En dat zie je hier gebeuren vandaag. Dat is heel erg mooi.
Not only the building has transformed, but the library itself has changed as well. A few years ago, the library opened a greenfield called the Kennismaker. In this creative space, the library looked for ways to share knowledge and stories in a different way than through a book. The experiences gained have been incorporated into the Loch Hall library concept. The collection still takes center stage as an inexhaustible source of information and inspiration. Also, the employees are essential. Ambitious and enthusiastic people who embrace opportunities and put them in action. But above all, the members of the community are key. Talented people showcase their knowledge or art and hone their craft. The residents who have difficulty integrating into the community are working on their skills. At the Loch Hall, all citizens can realize their potential. The library's program is determined by looking at the city. Sometimes the initiative lies within the library itself, but more often it comes from the library's visitors and partners. The activities take place in the open space or in one of the 6 labs. Here, experimentation is celebrated. Users can work together, learn together, and test ideas together. Traditional roles of student and teacher are blurred, as a user may be a student one moment and a teacher the next. The programmers support and facilitate the access to knowledge and connect communities and individuals.
In onze huiskamer van de stad kun je niet alleen koffie drinken, kun je niet alleen mooie boeken lenen, maar kun je naar een theatervoorstelling, kun je muziek beluisteren, kun je met elkaar in gesprek gaan over alle thema's die al onze inwoners raken. En dat is wat dit zo'n bijzondere plek maakt. En daarom ben ik daar enorm trots op.
In addition to the library, there are 2 more organizations in the Loch Hall, Kunstlok Brabant and Seats to Meet Tilburg. Kunstlok is an advocate for art and culture and fills the exposition space. At Seats to Meet, different spaces are available to rent for conferences or meetings. Knowledge, culture and entrepreneurship come together in the Lokhal. The hotspot is buzzing with creativity and renewal.
Als je om je heen kijkt, word je eigenlijk al geïnspireerd. Je ziet allerlei mensen die met van alles bezig zijn, waardoor je zelf ook gemotiveerd wordt om het beste voor jezelf hier eruit te halen. Dus als ik hier kom, dan zie ik mensen die met gaming bezig zijn, met programmeren. Je ziet kunstenaars, exposities. En dan denk ik van ja, ik wil ook iets doen. Ik wil ook iets bijdragen. Dus ja, het is wel echt wel een inspirerende plek, vooral voor jong talent, denk ik. Ja.
For Tilburg, this development has been unlike any other. A development that has left the citizens of Tilburg feeling prouder than ever. Everyone has found his or her place in the Lokhal since its opening. From student to the homeless, from young entrepreneur to CEO, from professor to grandfather and grandchild. Even outside of Tilburg, the Lokhal Library has not gone unnoticed.
Ja, de Lokhal, vroeger was dit de plek waar de treinen werden gemaakt. Dan werden daar de locomotieven opgetild en tegenwoordig tilt de Lokhal een hele stad op.
The library wants to be a unique learning and work environment where both young and old are challenged to pioneer a new path, to meet others, to experiment, to think and act freely, where community members translate worldwide societal issues in their own environment and to contribute locally to find solutions. It's a place to collaborate and develop initiatives from the bottom up for and by citizens.
Hier in het Future Lab bouwen we samen met inwoners van de stad sensoren voor in hun eigen tuin. De data die daaruit komt projecteren we hier op de monitor van de stad en vervolgens gaan we met de inwoners in gesprek over oplossingen voor klimaatverandering.
The Lokhal Library has all the ingredients needed to fulfill this role in society. It's a place that cultivates our inner world, makes our city stronger. You will always leave richer and inspired.
Hello, Peter, and what an inspiring project indeed. One that was years in the making. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you got ready for the project as you considered the library of the future. What tools did you use to consider the priorities and what lessons did you learn through that process?
Yes, of course I will tell you. At first, I want to apologize for my English. I'm not a native speaker, so I never practice my English.
It's beautiful.
But, yes, our project started in 2013. And we opened the new library in the Lokhal in January 2019. So 6 years before, when the local government decided that we could move to the Spoorzone, that new new urban area with 20 old buildings of the railway sheds. There we decided to have the kennismakerij, a small Lokhal in that area. We moved with a small team, a new team, to that Lokhal to develop the library of the future. And it was quite a greenfield. I think it's the only library in the world with no bookshelves, but we wanted to experiment the new functions of the library, the stage function, the working place function, and we started with a totally new team and program activities in that place. And it's a creative place with startups, and we want to learn our neighbors, our partners, and we tried to do the experimenting about the library of the future, with no big policy, no big plans, no return of investment, only good people, new people with a great network. They programmed activities, and that was great. It was very great because the piloting, experimenting, you take some changes, you do new things, you learn about it. And I can give you one story about how we learned about the future was that we organized a film evening about the book, you know, the book, The Great Gatsby, beautiful film and a great book. And only 4 people came at that evening. So
Oh, no.
how does that come? And that we learned at that time that it was not an actual theme, it was not an actual book. We liked that book and we liked that film, but the inhabitants of Tilburg didn't interest in that time. So we started to look to the local questions, the local needs, societal needs, and we decided we never do something alone. We always work with partners. And so we did a lot of experimental or pilots in that green field for 6 years. And after we closed the Kennismakerij, and we moved with all the ideas and all the experiences to the new Lock Hall in January 2019. Mm-hmm. So experimenting and piloting is necessary, and no borders, no, think big, have big ideas, and try and learn of your failures.
That's wonderful, Peter. Thank you. And you have continued that that ethos of partnerships and experimentation even as the building's open. You've mentioned that it's always changing. How do you prioritize what's next?
Yeah, we are part of the society. We changed our library from 100 years ago, a book lending library, to a programming library, and now we are a library who's in the middle of the society. And we adapt our building, our programming to the societal needs. We changed about the problems, the local problems, about the sustainable development goals, global goals. What are the questions our inhabitants concerns, and that we are programming with all the partners in the city. So we are a library who is community building, a library who work together with the local communities, and we listen to them and we program together. And you ask, how can you adapt to your library in the future? We have an open building. You've seen it there, a great open building. We have great open spaces, and we have a lot of open space, and we have 6 thematic labs. Now, for example, now we have a food lab about the questions you are in the society about your footprint, safety of food, obesitas, all things about food, what's healthy food. But perhaps in a few years later, there are other themes who are very important, other questions who concern to the inhabitants. Then we change the labs. So we can adapt the labs, the thematic labs, to the themes that are really actual at that time.
That's wonderful. And those partnerships are so important. And we have time for one. Yes, we have time for one more question. I'm going to shift to a different kind of partner. Your architectural partners. It may seem complex from the outside. You had 4 different firms involved. Were there some benefits of that creative tension, however, that you could talk about?
Yes, you are an architect as yourself. For us, 4 architect offices, it was a blessing. And you couldn't imagine it, I think, but for us, it was a blessing. We had some great architects. You've seen Francine Huben. Mm-hmm. She's now doing in New York, and she did Washington. And so she's a great architect, also in the Netherlands. She did the interior of the library. But also Petra Blaise is a great architect. And you know, great architects have strong opinions and different visions. And friction and struggling, that's okay. I like that, because it gives the best results. When they are quarreling, discussing, struggling, it gives the best result. You've seen it. It's great. It gives amazing results. Especially, I like diversity. No one is the same. Everyone likes something else. Diversity in materials, diversity in our library, in colors, in atmospheres, in spaces, in workplaces. So the diversity means that everybody knows his place or her place in the library where they like it, where they want to sit,
Wonderful.
they want to meet some people. So from day one, this library, the Lockhall Library, was embraced by all the inhabitants of Tilburg as their new living room of the city. And
it's just terrific, Peter.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's great. It's great. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. Really appreciated our conversation. And now we're going to shift gears to our final project story. Peter, you can go ahead and turn your camera off. And Jeanette, I see you're ready to go. We're going to shift gears to the McGill University's Fiat Lux project. All right, the floor is yours, Jeanette.
Thank you, Tracy. So as an architect with Shepley Bulfinch, I've worked on a lot of academic libraries through my careers, and the central piece is always to help them envision new spaces and ways of experiencing their community, research and learning. A building project is much more than an opportunity to change up a space. It's an opportunity to shape the future. So the central questions revolve around how do we build trust with a community, and how do we imagine a future that is often very fuzzy at best. So at McGill, the process actually began in 2014 when Shepley Bulfinch was engaged to help McGill create a new plan for their campus library system, and specifically to reimagine their flagship humanities and social sciences library context, the 40,000 square meter McLennan Redpath Library. Next slide. Next slide. After years of planning, we are currently studying options for building use, form, and site as the funding and approval process continues. The prominent site of the library anchors one end of a signature pathway that runs through the city of Montreal, connecting a series of important cultural sites. With its location at the juncture of McGill's urban campus and the city of Montreal, the project will afford the possibility to reconnect and better connect the university to the city, to reshape the identity of the university at this corner of campus, with the library complex becoming its welcoming front door. So the library itself, the McLennan Redpath complex, is a jumble of 3 buildings. If you could go to, yeah, there we go. And each of them is from a different era, and they are very tenuously connected to each other, which causes all kinds of functional and wayfinding challenges. So McLennan, which you see in green, is the workhorse of the library, accommodating about 2/3 of the library's programmatic space. It's in a very foreboding, brutalist style, and it sits right at that joint between the corner of the city and the campus. And then in red, you see Old Redpath Hall. This was the original library on campus, and its architecture is very emblematic of the history of the McGill campus, and it's a very beloved building. However, it has very small interior spaces that are not very well suited to the library's current needs. And then in between, the blue part is Redpath Library, which is actually a 1950s addition to Old Redpath Hall. But after many initial additional renovations and interventions, it's become very dysfunctional and confusing and does not really connect effectively at all to the structures flanking either side of it. Next slide. So the major challenge has been how to untangle this Gordian knot of disparate interior spaces. And there's a real opportunity in transforming the site so that this new building that will arise in this place will be a lantern that projects a welcoming beacon to the campus and to the surrounding city. Next slide. Defining the library's vision for spaces and programs was developed in tandem with defining the desired relationship with of the library to its neighbors, both open spaces and historic buildings such as Old Redpath Hall. The result is the concept of a library with multiple entrances and overall permeability in response to campus movement patterns and by taking advantage of adjacent outdoor green spaces. Strategies that enhance sustainability and wellness are integrated into every aspect of the project. If you go to the next slide, Reimagining often provides opportunities to not only improve energy performance and meet campus carbon neutrality goals, but also to attend to the wellness of the library's inhabitants. Next slide. So Reimagining also provides opportunities to explore new synergies. At McGill, the current library complex has some very important tenants: the Welcome Center, which hosts prospective students and their families, as well as the Service Center, which provides enrollment support for current students. The new complex will continue to house these services, but now they'll be integrated with the library rather than sectioned off. And the users of these services, as they enter, will be immediately immersed in a vibrant and welcoming environment that showcases research and scholarship on campus. Next slide. So disruptors require resets for our assumed patterns of work and space. And certainly recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a reevaluation of environments and operations everywhere. And while these types of disruptors can't be predicted, scenario planning exercises to test building assumptions in the face of dramatic change can help create buildings that are adaptable and resilient for whatever the future may bring us. Next slide. At the core of the process is to reimagine any library by building trust with the community. The leaders of the process must respond to diverse needs and cultures and allow each stakeholder to find their place in the conversation and then ultimately within the library. Conversations about space should start with experiences and activities, not with rooms. What do you hear, see, feel, smell? What do you want to do? Do you want to work, to socialize, reflect, or connect? So next slide. At McGill, part of making the case was communicating usage data and refuting myths. Some of the myths we encountered were that the students use the library only to socialize, and that science and technology students just simply didn't visit the library. In reality, as we collected usage data and compared it to the space allocation within the library, it was revealed that the overwhelming majority of visitors to the library came for serious study, collaboration, or to use the library's technology. And this was at odds with the actual space allocation within the library, in which over 50% of the library's space was devoted to storage of collections. This became a real launch point for rethinking the types of spaces that would define the library. Next slide. So in reimagining a library, we use a variety of formats to engage. We found that both virtual and in-person engagement is necessary to create a truly inclusive process. And we recommend that you challenge yourselves and your stakeholders to be comprehensive and unsparing in the analysis of your existing library, as you think about what to keep or continue, what to discontinue or toss, and what to create or add. So the next step in the process is always to become a bit more specific, to pair building ingredients lists with images that capture the activities you have in mind, especially for space types that are new or new to you and your stakeholders, and to test scale and functional groupings with diagrams that represent the actual sizes in relationship that the spaces will need. And then next slide. Finally, although the building is not designed yet, images can be created that will capture the spirit of your vision. For instance, in this planning concept proposal for McGill, the building is illustrated as a cultural portal that reveals its interior resources to the neighborhood and makes wayfinding within easy. And next slide. Also, with an idea for penthouse spaces that connect the top of the building with reading rooms that have views to campus roofscape and to Montreal Royale beyond. So next slide. To communicate the essence of the McGill project, we developed 3 simple essential design elements. These are important tools to distill and communicate the project potential. And we believe that a reimagined library is at once in an era an opportunity to make a difference for your community, to build trust with an inclusive communication plan, to imagine the unimaginable, to prioritize nimbleness in order to remain relevant, and throughout the process to keep circling back to these essential elements that define your library and will make your dreams a reality. Thank you, everybody.
Terrific. Thanks, Jeanette. And what a wonderful project. I'm looking forward to seeing it come to fruition. You mentioned the use of promotional imagery and some of those icons at the end that encapsulate the project story. Projects require funding often to become a reality. How do you help your clients present a case of need that stays relevant even when the project might be several years in the making, priorities may shift over time?
Well, it's really focusing on these key elements and thinking about a story that will be really very involved in very strong goals, a strong vision, yet leaving enough flexibility there that potential funders and supporters can find what they need. They can find their own story within the story of the library. And so even as details may change, and the details have changed many times on this project and continue to change for a while, I imagine, those essential components about clarity, a lantern, being welcoming and accessible have continued to be the pieces that define and that are what really matter about the project.
Wonderful, thank you. There are a lot of moving parts in a library of this scale in normal times, and then add to that the complexity of launching a project during a pandemic. I wonder, were there any serendipities that arose from that situation that are informing the design?
Sure, I mean, it's a great topic. And I think what it really did, you know, we had gone through one pretty detailed round of master planning and developing a brief before the pandemic. But because the library had to completely reset all of its operations, reset how collections were accessed, reset where staff were working, become much, much more forward-thinking in providing virtual services, it gave them an opportunity, well, or made the opportunity where they really had to test some new ideas and found that those could be fine-tuned and those could be central things that they would want to continue through and beyond the pandemic. For instance, getting people comfortable with either receiving certain services or getting access to collections through virtual means, and not always needing to browse the stacks in order to find information was one thing that came out of that. There will still be browsing, but it won't be the only way to access a collection.
Certainly, wonderful. It's a great lesson in seizing opportunities and expanding thinking about possibility. How else do you help your clients imagine the unknown?
Well, so we use a lot of different tools. I mean, I think the first thing is to know that not everybody receives information or shares information in the same way. So, you know, it ranges from doing very simple, you know, virtual surveys to things that are really very energetic in-person engagement series. And we try and use different ways of asking questions and understanding people and understanding how they relate to their environment, how they will use the library. For instance, there's a tool called Image Olympics that posts on really putting up a huge array, either virtually or physically, of images of different kinds of spaces, and then soliciting feedback about what people like and don't like about that. We usually do it with Post-it notes or green and red dots or something like that. So people are able to talk about aesthetic choices in an environment that is a little bit more safer than needing to engage in, you know, a more formal critique of a design. We also do a lot of role playing, ways that you can map your journey or the journey of a student through a space, through a community, through a campus. And we try to work with the library to help them prototype new services and spaces so that before the library is built, they've already experienced and introduced new models that they may want to have in the new building. And I think that's a really important part of developing those lessons learned while the risk is still a bit lower and you can adjust both design and operations as needed.
Certainly. Thank you, Jeanette, and good luck. And with the
Thank
next
you.
steps on the Fiat Lux project.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Now we'll have all of the panelists turn on your cameras and your audio. And Philip, what questions do our attendees have?
Hi, everyone, and thank you to a very engaged audience. We've had quite a few questions. Hopefully we can touch on some of the themes that have been emerging from them. And certainly, I think as we've sort of gone from the projects that have taken some time and started a long time in advance, right through to actually living and breathing in those new facilities, lots of questions have arisen. And it was helpful, I think, because what Jeanette was just talking about at the end was how you balance and tools to juggle those competing interests. But, you know, our audience is a lot of librarians, and so there are a lot of questions that have come up today about, you know, some of those traditional issues like balancing collections, books, balancing silent versus very busy. And I just wondered if each of the panelists had some further suggestions for how you traversed that and thought about the future.
Yes, I think we all do. Who would you like to start, Philip?
So Sarah, you're speaking. Tell us a bit more about how you made those hard choices.
The balance between collections and other uses of spaces was really key in Vision 2020. We had an allied project which was to create off-site collection storage, which allowed us to rethink what the key collections that we needed to have in the main building that you saw in the presentation were. We kept the percentage of collection the same. We didn't want to reduce the amount of collection that was available to people. And what we actually did was, it was probably clear in one of the earlier videos, but originally State Library Victoria had one main entrance off a street called Swanson Street. We reopened an older entrance, which was at the other end of the building, the other end of the city block called Russell Street. Those two, we created a welcome zone in each. And what happens is if you come into the Swanson Street end of the building, you are in all of the collaborative spaces. There is no physical collection. We're much looser on, you know, what you can do in those spaces, what you can bring in. All of our audio digitising studios, all of our maker spaces, our children's and families areas, our events areas are in that area. And then if you come into the Russell Street end, where you might have noticed we have a retail bookshop, you go through the collection zone. And the collection zone is the whole of the city block, but it's on the next level up. It's not hidden because you have an entrance that takes you right through into the collection. So you would go from the Russell Street entrance through into the World Knowledge Collection. You have the arts collection reading room next to that. You have the newspapers and family history reading room next to that. You would walk through the paintings gallery, have exhibition spaces on the side, through the very famous La Trobe domed reading room, which has our Australiana collection and two other exhibition spaces. And then because of Vision 2020, you can walk through into the space you can see behind me that I spoke about in one of Tracy's questions, the Ian Potter Quench Hall, which was the original library building that was created when in the gold rush period in Victoria. And that has collection in it as well. So we tried to allow for, separate the different uses, make the most of creating another entrance so that people, whatever their interests are, they can direct themselves to that, but maintain the amount of collection that people could access and stop. The problem that we had before was that there was a conflict. Every space was being used for differing things. So people who wanted quiet space, people were trying to talk within. We were very, very popular in terms of events. And so we didn't have the right organisation of trolley routes for catering. And so that was going through public spaces. So it was about just rethinking and separating that. And in fact, to go to Jeanette's point, one of our learnings was what was not working, where the tensions were. So how do you resolve the tensions that you had in place? And if you could resolve those, that gave you a sense of how you might use the space.
Thanks.
Sorry, that's quite a long answer.
You're right. Yeah, no, that's fine. And Peter, you had 4 institutions who had different needs. How did you juggle those 4 institutions?
Yes, it's quite difficult, but I'm lucky because we are the biggest institutions. 2/3 of the spaces, of the square meters of our local is the public library. It's 10,000 square meters in totally. And so it is also the public library where you want to go. So we are the main user. So we decided a lot about the things. And about the question of the books, the collection in our library, the books are the right of our right to exist. But lending books is not our core business, but they are very important. And our core business is being helpful in our society, community building, local questions to help the inhabitants. That's our core business. And it's quite obvious that the library is an open space where the books are very important, but not the core business. But we have 500,000 of books, so we have a lot of books. We have high quality collection, so everybody can lend the book you want to lend. But the activities and the programming activities are also very important. So we have developed the new functions of the library in our public library of the Lock Hall.
Thanks, Peter. And Jeanette, the idea of the lantern, there were questions about the porosity, the inside, outside, yes, attracting people. Do you want to say something about that?
Sure. I think that, you know, this is a very, very big campus library, and campuses need to be able to connect people and move people through them. And so when you look at a library today, very often you need to make it more permeable, because otherwise it becomes a blockage within the campus rather than the connector and the destination you want them to be. So then, you know, that there are the pieces about personal security, which are important to any campus building. The pieces about collection security then often need to be handled differently. So there may be zones of the library that are public and very accessible, others that are maybe more associated with the collection that may have more limited control. And we work through those with the library to make sure that all the operations make sense for them.
Good. Well, thank you all very much. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but we will, as a committee, keep looking at our website, because some of the themes that have been coming up through the questions we've addressed in different ways. Back to you, Tracy. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Philip. And well, folks, that slide means that our time is up. Thanks again to all 3 of our panelists for their terrific presentations and sharing their insights. Be sure to check IFLA's YouTube channel for the recording of today's session so you can listen again or share the webinar with your colleagues. And please follow us on our social media channels. Our team is continually posting great resources about all things library design. Links are in the chat and also easily found by searching in your favorite web browser, IFLA Library Buildings and Equipment. Thank you all for attending, and be well. Goodbye.